Welcome to the Technical Futures for Engineering Leaders series. My name's Chris McKinney and I'm Managing Director with Technical Futures and Diligence Partners, recruiters and leadership advisors to the New Zealand infrastructure sector. In this series, we talk with the experts around the impacts, opportunities and the work to solve New Zealand's biggest infrastructure challenges. So we're very lucky today to have 4 leaders on our panel to talk about water sector reform, all of whom make major contributions to the New Zealand water sector. I'd like to wish a warm welcome to Dave Hogg, Regional Manager Water for New Zealand for Stantec, Daniel Patten, Engineering Manager for New Zealand and the Pacific Islands with McConnell Dowell, Gillian Blythe, Chief Executive for Water New Zealand, and Raveen Jaduram, Professional Director. So thank you very, very much for spending time to talk about water sector reform. So welcome everybody, and thanks so much for joining us. Why reform? What's wrong with how we deliver water services in New Zealand and to New Zealanders currently? And what does reform hope to improve or enable? Local government has been talking about the need for water reform for a very long time. This is not a new conversation, and in fact, successive New Zealand governments have agreed that change is required, but only recently has the desire for change been translated into proposed reforms for the water sector. Significantly more investment is needed in our water services delivery and infrastructure over the next 30 years. And again, this is something everyone agrees on, no matter what they think of the current shape of reform proposals. Three Waters reform aims to improve how New Zealand's stormwater, drinking water and wastewater services are delivered. Currently, these services sit in the hands of 67 local authorities who utilise a range of operating models and structures to deliver to their customers. The reform proposes shifting the delivery of Three Waters services to 4 new entities. These entities will have the scale and balance sheets to borrow enough to fund New Zealand's water infrastructure upgrades, both now and in the future, and in theory will deliver significant operational efficiencies. Water assets will remain publicly owned by councils who will play a key role in the entity's governance and priority setting processes. So Gillian, I wanted to start with you because I think that you bring a unique perspective to this discussion. In your role as Chief Executive for Water New Zealand, you would have close relationships with the 67 local authorities, relationships with central government, and relationships with the agencies driving the change for water sector reform. And I think our audience would appreciate a really high-level view on the scale and the complexity of the change that we're undertaking.
Thank you. So New Zealand has got 67 councils that are providing water services. New Zealand as a population is just over 5 million. So if you're thinking in terms of Europe, you would expect far fewer organisations to be responsible for water. So we've got some large players like Watercare who provide water services in Auckland, but there are many smaller councils that are providing it. And so the proposal is that you take 67 and you create 4 large entities that are geographically located. There is one in Auckland up to the top of the North Island, one that 2 others that are in the middle of the North Island, one in the bottom of the North Island, and then one that is pretty much most of the South Island. And that's because you want to create scale. All of them will have at least 600 to 800,000 people that they're serving. So you enable that level. But bringing together, if you merge 2 organisations, we all know that can be quite complex. So if you're merging 67, there's quite a few pieces of the puzzle that you need to go through.
So what are those pieces of the puzzle?
So some of it can be staff. There's been a commitment that if your primary role in a council is to do with water, then you are guaranteed a role. And then there are opportunities for the more senior members that they will have other roles that they can apply for. So staffing is one. But if you think about it, billing engines. If you're bringing together 25 councils, they will all have separate systems. You think about SCADA, you think about your asset management plans. All of them will be different across with different challenges depending on the region. but some of it will be they've operated on different standards. You know, the manhole covers will be different. The types of pipes that you put in, the approaches to how you address renewals or replacements will all be different. And so there is a need to have some national standards, some consistent approaches to addressing the infrastructure deficit that we've got.
And this is a cultural change as much as an organisational change. You know, the new entities are going to have staff coming from, you know, quite a wide-ranging geographical spread in some cases. You know, and the challenge of bringing those people together and aligning them with the goals of the entities, no small task.
It's huge.
Yeah.
So, Daniel, if I can move on to a question I wanted to pose to you, what's the benefit? So, what's the real benefit to the water sector by delivering the water sector reform? And more broadly, how's it going to impact industry stakeholders and everyday Kiwis?
Yeah, I think so. Starting with the benefits, obviously we're going to have that ability to leverage scale and get access to capital, which is difficult for a lot of the entities that Gillian's already spoken about. The other big benefits we see coming through is the standardisation. We build infrastructure for water around New Zealand, and we very, very rarely do the same thing twice. So we're looking forward to that standardisation of commercial arrangements and also technical standards and requirements. And then with standardisation and scale, then we can start to build pipelines of work. You know, by aggregating lots of small asset management plans to larger plans, smoothing out what can be quite a lumpy industry with good capital streams, and then building pathways for people to feed into that process. And what we very much hope will be a sort of a sustained ramp up to an increased level of productivity. Just last week I was at the Civil Contractors Conference in Christchurch. We had a great presentation there from Internal Affairs talking about current asset management plans over the country totalling to around 1.4 billion per annum. The current plans expect to grow to 2.7, but actually to meet the growth that's been and the need that's been forecast, that needs to be more like 4 to 6 billion per annum. So we're talking a substantial uplift on what we currently do as business as usual. So yes, build that scale, and then build confidence and continuity, and then that will garner the investment in technology and people and plant that we need to deliver that.
Do you think sorry, Gillian.
Sorry, if I can add, so the 4 to 6 billion isn't just a sort of a one-off.
No,
you know, it's
over
over a
30
concerted period. You know, that we've got figures of needing between 120 billion to 185 billion over a 30-year period.
That's right.
And so it's a long challenge. You know, it's not a short-term fix and then we can, you know, continue as normal.
But a fantastic opportunity.
A huge opportunity. Yeah. Do you think it's going to deliver major operational efficiencies?
I should think yes. If we can get to a standardisation of solutions, for example, we can then look at, I guess, as a New Zealand Inc., a buying power that comes with that, and the standardisation of the skill sets in the plant we need to implement them. So we standardise the specifications, that drives through the technology we require, the skill sets, and then we can take further steps into technology such as off-site manufacture and modularisation of our solutions.
And is it genuinely that easy to standardise across the different geographies of New Zealand and the different needs of the districts? When you're talking about capital programs and wastewater treatment plants, for instance.
Yeah, well, maybe a good one for David. I mean, water is water wherever you are in New Zealand. There are uniqueness in our different regions. Seismicity, for example, how you design for earthquakes, and different receiving environments for treated wastewater, for example. So there are those nuances, but I think ultimately it's going to be a lot of give and take between those amalgamated entities to agree on a good fit that drives that efficiency.
There are a lot of regional uniquenesses, and I think there's no real reason why there can't be more alignment and standards across the country, and one would expect that if reform's successful, that will happen. Where there'll be 4 entities and maybe only 4 ways of doing things instead of many dozens of ways. I also think if the assets over time become more standardised, then it's a bit easier for the new entities to have operators that are familiar with the various plants around their geography. So instead of having 10 different plants with 10 different operators, you might only need 3 or 4 to roam, and so I think there's definitely economies of scale opportunities here.
Which might mean that there's also opportunities for career advancement, being able to go from one entity to another in terms of, having got more experience with very similar kit.
So Raveen, I've known you for a very long time now, and you were heavily involved in local government reform and amalgamation around 2010. So I think, again, you bring a unique perspective to this discussion, because I think that's probably the second biggest change project that New Zealand's seen. So what do you think are the key differences, and what are the risks?
You're talking about the Auckland amalgamation?
Yes.
Yes. So the Auckland amalgamation compared to the New Zealand reform, they're very different. The Three Waters reform as proposed is significantly more complex. Some of the examples, for example, in the Auckland amalgamation, Watercare was an existing entity, and it took over the retail functions from 6 other councils. So the systems that Gillian was talking about, most of the systems were already there, the people were there. The Auckland councils already had a water sector group. Standardization had already happened or was taking place. Compared to all of that, what we've got here is 4 new entities will be set up. There will be no existing entity that will use its system. It's further complicated because of stormwater. So the reform, the amalgamation in 2010, Watercare was a company. Companies exist in New Zealand, and the functions were the functions of a company. What is proposed now is a statutory authority, a unique being. So everything has to be defined. The bill that is in Parliament right now defines what the board is, what its role is, because it's not a company, it's a unique entity. And the legislation that will follow will have to define precisely how the services will be performed, how income will be achieved by the 4 water entities, because it will not be a pay for service. So contractually, as Watercare is at the moment, you receive a service and you pay. It's a contract. Going forward, it is more likely to be similar to a council where it's a tax. As soon as you introduce stormwater, there is no pay for service. It's something that everyone will receive. It is going to be a major exercise in terms of cultural change, change for people who are in the industry, whether they are directly employed or indirectly as consultants and service providers. It's going to be a huge change for the community who receive the service. There's already controversial elements to this reform because people are not sure how much of the local is going to remain in the local government aspect. So in a nutshell, it's a new challenge for New Zealand. It's a new challenge. It's an exciting challenge. I mean, the industry has been asking for reform for decades, and it's here now. It's probably going to be in a form that most people were not expecting. It's not going to be a Watercare or a Wellington Water, or it's going to be profoundly unique, and therefore there will be mistakes made. There is going to be gaps in legislation. There is going to be teething issues, which for me is an exciting phase because there's going to be learning as we go along. We do not have a predetermined position as to this is exactly how it's going to work. What we do know is the outcomes we want out of this. We want better service, we want higher efficiencies, we want economies of scale, we want a separated balance sheet so that the entities can use their balance sheet to borrow, because the program of capital works is huge. So we want all those outcomes, but in trying to solve the one or two problems that we've had in terms of drinking water standards not being met, wastewater discharges not being met, funding not being available, there's going to be lots of other small problems that will eventuate. So leadership is required. Leadership will be very crucial. Leadership at the governance level of the 4 entities, leadership in the roles of the chief executive, leadership in the executives, and the leadership between the 4 entities and the supply chain, because they will have to do things differently.
Are there risks, just sticking on the supply chain piece, are there risks around that in terms of knocking out some of the smaller players within the supply chain? So if you're centralising services and you're centralising contracts, is that going to play down into the smaller water contractors or civil contractors or smaller design engineers after the entities are set up, do you think?
Generally, large organizations contract with large organizations. I mean, that's generally the approach. Because if you have too many players, the effort goes into managing all those supply chain elements. So I would say there will be a natural tendency to have fewer players in the supply chain. There will need to be reform, not forced, but by default, in the industry. There is going to be amalgamation, there is going to be the number of players may reduce, the number of players may increase. It all depends on how each one of those 4 entities decide to contract out. So for example, if we look at maintenance contracting, Watercare currently has 3 regions that it does maintenance contracting. One area it does itself, and the other 2 it contracts out. If Watercare, for example, decided that it would only have 1 contractor, then the burden would be shared among the 66 other entities in New Zealand. But when you have 4 players, if they decide that they will have 1 maintenance contractor each, then there's only room for 4 maintenance contractors. If they decide that they will have 3 or 4 contractors each, then there's room for 12 to 16 contractors. From my point of view, it is very important that the 4 entities ensure that a market exists. It will be a huge risk to the industry if the number of players are reduced, that a market is unable. New Zealand is small as it is, and therefore it needs to have sufficient number of players. It will very much depend on how the local element stays in local government. There are parts of New Zealand which even the large players won't want to be involved in. You know, especially when you have natural disasters, when you have a storm event, and you know you need the local players who are there, the local contractors, the man, the mum, the dad, the uncle, and
who are
the
on
son,
the ground.
You know, the ute and the dog. You know, they turn up.
Raveen, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I agree that the entities will make a procurement decision to contract, you know, in their own way. But there are examples where an entity can have fewer relationships, but within those relationships come a team of suppliers, and there's there's an expectation that those teams contract large, medium, and small entities to provide a service that. For instance, I know that's the case in Wellington at the moment, where there's 3 main consultants, but there was a requirement to maintain a healthy market by bringing in smaller players that the lead consultants manage to take that burden off the entity. And I think that kind of that strikes a good balance between having fewer relationships to manage, and the efficiencies that brings, but also investing in the supply chain.
Exactly. I mean, the water industry is very collaborative. They don't compete with each other. Even the contractors and the consultants, they work together, and very much, hopefully, in future that continues, because the 4 water entities will need to work together to ensure that market exists. They're not actually competing. They may compete in terms of levels of service. They may compete for staff. They may compete for resources. It's extremely important to make sure that the industry and those contractors have the incentive to invest in people, invest in technology and in processes to increase our productivity. I mean, New Zealand and the construction sector has very low productivity. Here's an opportunity for the water industry to demonstrate that it can increase productivity in a significant manner. I mean, when Watercare, in the amalgamation in 2010, in the first year, Watercare saved $100 million and then continued savings. And that is one reason why it was less controversial. This huge reform, Three Waters reform, will need to deliver to the communities in terms of either better value for money. There may be increased charges, but the environment, the receiving environment needs to be better. The service needs to be better. The risks that you were talking about, the risks are that this is a big bite for New Zealand. This whole reform started because of failure in the treatment of water, and also, as the industry knows, failure to treat wastewater. So, and underinvestment in stormwater. It's the poor cousin of the Three Waters. The 4 entities can get so occupied with the administration in the first few years in terms of setting itself up, getting the IT going, and IT can be a real problem, information systems, putting together all the existing data, all of that can be so overwhelming that the first decade is lost just trying to get yourself sorted rather than address the issue that it has been set up or will be set up for. I would say that is the biggest risk, that the entities get so preoccupied with just trying to get itself to work.
Yeah.
And that biggest risk is also the biggest fear of the industry, that we'll have, as the new entities roll out, a decent and sustained depression in the continuity of work. So, I mean, and just to David's earlier point, I think a full depth and healthy supply chain is really important. There's that it makes sense that big entities will probably initially contract with high tier 1 larger contractors as an example, but tier 1 contractors don't do well or can't offer all the services that are required to build new infrastructure, complete renewals, or maintain what's there. So I think it would be really important that we sustain a good healthy supply chain from SMEs up and also that we retain those skills in the regions via those various organisations to have people live, work and play in their region and maintain their own and build their own assets.
Just in terms of the risk of a slowdown while the entities get up to speed, I think the 67 councils in some cases are doing a really good job of trying to be proactive and extend their current supply chain contracts to a point just beyond 1st of July 2024, so that there's some certainty for us as suppliers and some certainty for the new entity, so that while they are grappling with priorities and levels of service and finance and IT, that they've got delivery engines that are fed with work that are beavering away to deliver the programs. And I'm seeing more and more of that over the last sort of 6 to 12 months.